My name is Elijah Dixon, but everybody just calls me Eli. I'm 74 years old now, and I live right here in Willow Creek, Mississippi. I worked my entire life as a metal fabricator and welder, making everything from farm equipment to decorative gates. And today, I live quietly on my pension. Well, quiet is just a figure of speech because after everything that went down, it took a long time for peace to settle back in my heart. Goodness gracious. When you think you know someone like the back of your hand and then you suddenly discover you didn't know a thing, that's what happened to me after 4 decades married to the same woman. I never thought I'd tell this story to anyone, but I feel like maybe it can serve as a warning to whoever is listening. I'm glad you are here. If you are watching this video, give it a like, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are listening to my story from. I want to know how far it has reached. You spend your life building a history, believing in people, trusting them with your eyes closed, and then one small thing, one simple choice, turns it all upside down. For me, it was a trip I decided not to take at the last minute. If I'd gone like I'd planned, maybe I'd still be living in that peaceful little illusion today. But fate, or maybe the good Lord, who really knows, had other plans. It was March of 2020. I was 69 then. Grace and I had been married over 40 years. We'd built an entire life together. 2 kids, a home on the land my daddy left me, and more memories than I could count. That month, I was supposed to drive up to Memphis to visit my brother Curtis, who'd fallen ill. Grace said she couldn't come because she had church commitments. Sounded reasonable. She even mentioned she'd use the time to deep clean the house and donate some of my old clothes. Nothing unusual at all. The plan was to leave Wednesday morning and stay about a week. Tuesday night, I packed my bag, laid out my pills, and Grace baked one of her famous sweet potato pies for Curtis. He always loved her pie. Then, before dawn, my nephew called. Curtis had been admitted to the hospital, and it'd be better to wait a few days before visiting. I was worried, sure, but it made sense. No point driving all that way if I couldn't even see him because of hospital restrictions. That's when a thought came to me. Instead of telling Grace the trip was canceled, I figured I'd surprise her. Our marriage had been feeling a little distant lately, the kind of quiet that creeps in after so many years together. I thought maybe I'd pretend to leave as planned, then come back later that evening with flowers and a little gift, make her dinner, open a good bottle of wine. I thought it'd be sweet. A romantic gesture. Silly for a 69-year-old man, I guess, but at the time, it felt like a good idea. What I didn't know was that decision, just that one, would change my life completely. Not in the way you'd hope. It was the kind of truth you never expect, the kind that shatters everything you thought you knew. You can live beside someone your whole life and still have no idea who they really are. Some things, my friends, only God Himself ever truly knows. I was born right here in Willow Creek, back in 1951, when the world looked a whole lot different from what it is now. My daddy, Robert Dixon, owned a small patch of land where he grew corn and soybeans, same as just about everyone around here back then. There were 5 of us kids. Me, Curtis, Marcus, Tanisha, and Chantel. I was the second oldest. Our home was a simple wood frame house with a potbelly stove that never went out during winter. Lord, those winters were cold. Frost would blanket everything before sunrise, and we'd head out with numb toes to help with the chores. Life wasn't easy, but it was good. My mama, Soledad, made the best collard greens and fried catfish with hush puppies you could ever imagine. And those Sunday pot roasts, gravy, mashed potatoes, cornbread, the kind of meal that feels like home in every bite. When there was a little extra money, she'd bake a peach cobbler. We'd eat it warm, with a glass of fresh milk straight from the cow. Pure heaven. I went to the little country schoolhouse about 2 miles from home, made it up to the 4th grade. We walked there every day, rain or shine. When it poured, Mama would wrap us in old burlap sacks she stitched together, but we'd still end up soaked by the time we got there. In the dead of winter, some days we just couldn't make it at all. The teachers understood. Every kid had farm work to do back then. I must have been around 9, maybe 1960, when I first found my calling. Daddy took me to Frank Powell's machine shop to get a broken tool fixed. Mr. Powell was a big man. Strong, the kind of man you could tell had seen things. He'd fought in the war and settled here afterward. I remember watching him shape that red-hot steel, sparks flying everywhere, the hammer ringing out on the anvil like music. I was mesmerized. I looked up at my daddy and said, "One day I'm gonna be just like him, Daddy." Daddy smiled and said, "If that's what you want, son, you're gonna have to work hard." And work hard I did. When I turned 14, back in '65, I started helping Mr. Powell after school and on weekends. At first, all I did was sweep the shop, stoke the forge, and keep his tools in order. But little by little, the old man started teaching me the trade. He didn't have any sons, just 2 girls, so I think he saw something in me. He used to tell me, in that rough, gravelly voice of his, "Eli, steel's a lot like people. It's got a temperament. Sometimes it's soft, sometimes it's stubborn. You just gotta know when to work it." I remember every Willow Creek County Fair like it was yesterday. Mr. Powell always made sure I came over for dinner afterward. His table would be covered end to end with barbecue ribs, mac and cheese, collard greens, sweet tea, and every kind of pie you could imagine. His wife, Miss Helen, treated me like one of her own. It felt like family. Then came 1968. I was 17 when the big flood hit. The muddy creek rose higher than anyone had seen before, and a lot of folks around here lost just about everything. Our house sat on higher ground, thank the Lord, but Mr. Powell's shop went completely under. I spent 2 weeks alongside him, hauling out what we could save. Most of the tools rusted beyond repair, and the furnace had to be built from scratch. It was a tough time, but right in the middle of all that mud and ruin, he looked at me and said, "Eli, you ain't my apprentice anymore. You're my partner now." That was one of the proudest moments of my life. By the time I turned 18, in 1969, I'd learned everything that man had to teach. I started crafting my own pieces, knives, farm tools, decorative hinges, and folks around the county began asking for me by name. "I want that Dixon boy to do it," they'd say. Mr. Powell never once showed jealousy. He'd just grin and say, "That's how it ought to be." Back then, farming was changing fast. Machines were getting bigger, tools more specialized, and we had to keep up. Farmers would come in with hand-drawn sketches, just rough ideas, and we'd turn them into working tools. It felt good, turning someone's thought into steel and shape. Life wasn't all work, though. On weekends, we'd gather at the community center to play dominoes, sip coffee, or head to church socials where there was music and laughter. I wasn't much of a party man, always the quiet type, but I liked being around people, swapping stories, sharing a few laughs. We didn't have television or all the gadgets folks do now, but the fun we had back then was real and simple. Then, in 1970, when I was 19, came the first real heartbreak of my life. Mr. Powell had a stroke right there at the forge. I saw it happen, saw the hammer slip from his hand and him clutch his chest. I ran to help, called for the ambulance, but by the time they got there, it was too late. Losing him felt like losing a second father. After the funeral, Miss Helen called me over. She said, "Eli, Frank wanted you to have the shop. It was his dream to see you carry on his work." She offered to sell me his share little by little, however I could manage it. It was a heavy responsibility for a 19-year-old, running a whole business on his own. But I couldn't let his legacy die. So I took it on, became the owner of the only fabrication shop in Willow Creek. Still just a young man, but with a lifetime of work and dreams ahead of him. My daddy stood behind me all the way. He could already see that I wasn't cut out for farm work like my brothers. Curtis and Marcus followed in his footsteps, tending to the crops, while my sisters, Tanisha and Chantel, married young, both to farmers' sons from nearby. I was the odd one out, the one who chose a different road. But Daddy never held that against me. He'd just smile and say, "Every man's got to follow what his heart tells him, son, and yours has always burned hot like the fire in that forge." It was 1972, and I was 21 when I met Grace. She had just come down from Memphis to teach at the local school. Willow Creek was growing back then. New families settling in, more children, more teachers needed. Grace was one of them. A beautiful young woman with long dark hair, warm brown eyes, and a gentle voice that caught my attention the very first time I saw her. I remember it clear as day. She walked into my shop one afternoon holding a small brass bell they used at the school to call the kids in from recess. The bell had cracked, and she asked if I could fix it. "Are you the welder?" she said, surprised I was so young. "Yes, ma'am, that's me, Eli," I told her. "And you don't have to call me, sir. I ain't that old," I joked. She laughed, and that laugh warmed something deep inside me. I fixed the bell, polished it up, and when she came back to pick it up, I asked if she'd like to grab a cup of coffee at T's Grill, the little spot on the corner where everyone in Willow Creek hung out. They had the best coffee in the county, with lemon pound cake, hot biscuits, and gravy. She said yes, and that coffee turned into the first of many conversations. Grace wasn't like the girls around here. She'd studied in the city, read books I'd never even heard of, talked about things I could only half understand, but she never once made me feel small for it. Instead, she wanted to hear about my work, how I shaped metal, how Mr. Powell had taught me. She listened with real curiosity, and that meant something to me. We started courting that April. It wasn't easy at first. Her parents in Memphis weren't too keen on their educated daughter seeing a welder from a small town. But Grace was strong-willed. "They'll just have to accept it," she said, "because I've made my choice." And sure enough, once they got to know me, they came around. They saw I might not have a fancy education, but I was honest and hard-working. Our courtship lasted 2 years. 2 beautiful years filled with discovery and dreams. We'd stroll through town hand in hand, dance at the community hall, laugh at the county fair with its rodeo games, country music, and cold beer. I'd go to the Christmas pageants at her school and watch her eyes light up with joy. Those were good times. Simple, pure, and full of promise. I always helped set up the props, and everyone already knew we were a couple. In 1974, when I was 23, I finally asked her to marry me. I'd saved up enough to buy a simple ring, the best I could afford, and took her to Gazebo Park, a quiet, pretty spot near Willow Creek. It was autumn, the leaves turning golden, the air crisp but the sun still gentle on our faces. I knelt down by the old fountain and asked her to be my wife. She started crying, threw her arms around me, and said yes. That moment right there, it was one of the happiest days of my life. We got married in January of 1975. I was 24, she was 22. The ceremony was simple, held at the First A.M. Zion Church, just the way our folks had always done it. Afterwards, we celebrated at the community center with pulled pork barbecue, ribs, potato salad, and plenty of cold beer, because no party in Willow Creek ever went without it. A local jazz band played, and we danced like we didn't have a care in the world. For our honeymoon, we went to Nashville. Just 3 days, because I couldn't afford to keep the shop closed any longer than that. But those 3 days felt like magic. When we came back, we settled into a small rental house near the shop. It wasn't much, but it was ours. Grace kept teaching, and I threw myself into work. Willow Creek was growing fast. More farms, more houses, more people who needed fences, gates, and railings. The orders kept coming, and I thanked the Lord every day for it. By 1977, when I was 26, we managed to buy our first piece of land. It was a decent lot, what's now the center of Willow Creek, but back then, folks thought it was way out in the sticks. We started small, first a shed for my workshop, then slowly built the house itself. I carried every brick with my own 2 hands, after long days at the forge. Grace worked right beside me, painting, cleaning, turning that place into a home. Those were the best years, full of hard work and togetherness. We shared the same dream, to build a steady life, raise our children, and be thankful for what the Lord provided. At night, after a long day, we'd sit on the porch with our coffee, look up at the stars, and talk about tomorrow. She'd tell me stories about her students, and I'd tell her about new orders coming in. That's how life went, one day at a time. Then, in 1978, when I was 27, came an opportunity that changed everything. A manufacturer in Memphis wanted me to supply them with agricultural parts in bulk. It was a big step, meant hiring help and buying new machines. I spent nights talking it through with Grace. She was the smart one, helped me figure out the costs and risks. "If this is what you want, Eli, I'm with you," she said. And just like that, I went from being the town welder to a small-time businessman, with my wife right there beside me, believing in me every step of the way. I hired 2 helpers, young men from the community who wanted to learn the trade just as I had. Bit by bit, I expanded the old shed and bought new tools. The work doubled, the long days doubled too, but the satisfaction of seeing the business grow made every ache worth it. Grace used to tease me sometimes, saying, "I'm jealous of your shop, Eli. You spend more time in there than you do with me." She wasn't wrong, but she always said it with a smile. Then in 1979, when I was 28, we got the best news of our lives. Grace was pregnant. We'd been hoping for it for a while, and when the doctor confirmed it, we celebrated like it was Christmas morning. Grace kept teaching until about 6 months along, then took a break to rest and get ready. We poured our hearts into preparing for that baby. I built the crib myself out of mesquite wood with wrought iron details, and Grace spent her evenings knitting tiny clothes, sewing blankets, and decorating the nursery. Our first child, Jamal, was born in May of 1980, when I was 29. A strong, healthy boy with cheeks as pink as the apples from the orchard behind our house. I still remember that first cry. The sound hit me straight in the chest. Holding that tiny baby in my rough, calloused hands was the most humbling thing I'd ever felt. "You take good care of him," Grace said, exhausted but smiling from her hospital bed in Memphis. "We had to go there since Willow Creek didn't have a proper maternity ward back then." And from that moment on, everything changed. Grace took some time off from teaching to stay home with Jamal, and I threw myself into work to make up for the lost income. But I never complained. Every little smile, every new thing my boy discovered, it made all the long hours worth it. I'd come home tired, but there was always enough energy left to play with him, give him his bath, tell him stories. Grace said I spoiled him, and she was right. I did, and I was proud of it. 3 years later, in 1983, when I was 32, Grace was expecting again. This time we were calmer, more confident. We knew what was coming. Jamal, just 3 years old, didn't quite understand what being a big brother meant, but we tried to prepare him. "You'll have to look out for the baby and teach them things," I told him, and he puffed up with pride. In January of 1984, our daughter, Zoe, was born. If Jamal was my spitting image, Zoe was all her mother. The same soft eyes, the same bright smile. Our little princess completed our family. The house that once felt big now seemed smaller with toys scattered everywhere, laughter echoing from room to room. It was a mess, but a beautiful kind of mess. The 1980s were good to us. Life was steady, peaceful. Dixon Metalworks had earned a fine reputation around the region. Sometimes orders even came in from as far as Atlanta for specialized pieces that only I could make just right. Business was thriving, our family was growing, and for a long while there, it felt like everything was exactly as it should be. Grace went back to teaching when Zoe turned 2, and we found a trustworthy woman, Ms. Lupita, who looked after the kids while we were working. It was a simple life, but full and happy. At least, that's what I believed back then. The 1990s rolled in, bringing all sorts of changes to the world, but here in Willow Creek, life carried on at its own quiet pace. By 1990, when I was 39, the shop had become a solid, well-known business. I had 5 employees, all trained by me, and we'd started making decorative gates that were selling even beyond Mississippi. Jamal, 10 years old by then, loved tagging along after school, learning the craft bit by bit, just the way I'd once learned from Mr. Powell. Zoe, at 6, was more like her mother, always with a book in hand, sharp as a tack, impressing every teacher she had. In 1992, when I was 41, Grace was promoted to principal of the elementary school, a well-earned recognition for all her years of dedication. I was so proud of her, proud of the life we'd built together. Our home was finally complete by then, with a little garden out front that Grace tended on weekends and a small orchard out back with oranges, lemons, and even a grapevine that gave just enough fruit for a few bottles of homemade wine each year. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm, comfortable, and ours. Family traditions ran deep with us. Every Sunday, our house filled up with laughter and noise. My brothers and sisters, their spouses, their kids. I'd fire up the stone barbecue pit I built myself, grilling ribs and chicken, while the women fixed potato salad, rolls, and that southern rice and beans no one else could ever make quite right. The kids ran wild in the yard, and we adults sat on the porch drinking coffee, swapping stories the children had heard 100 times but always begged to hear again. Then came 1995, when I was 44, and with it, the worst flood I'd ever seen. The big muddy creek rose higher than anyone could remember, flooding parts of town that had never gone under before. Our house sat high enough to be safe, but the shop wasn't so lucky. It went under water. We lost machines, materials, and finished jobs that were ready for delivery. It was a heavy loss, but that's when I saw what kind of community we had. My workers, my neighbors, everybody showed up to help. Grace was tireless during those weeks. She organized fundraisers at the school, gathered donations, and somehow balanced all that while still doing her job. The kids pitched in too. Jamal, 15 then, worked beside me like a grown man, and Zoe, 11, helped her mama keep track of supplies and donation lists. It was hard, Lord, it was hard, but that flood brought us even closer as a family. By 1996, we'd not only recovered, we'd come back stronger. The shop was rebuilt, the work picked up again, and life settled back into its steady rhythm. Looking back, that storm tested us, but it also reminded me how lucky I was to have Grace, our kids, and a community that stood by us when it mattered most. I built the shop on higher ground. This time, I made sure it could withstand whatever nature threw our way. We expanded the space, added new machines, and invested in more modern equipment. Business was booming, and before long, I had to bring on 2 more employees. I didn't spend as much time at the forge as I once did. I'd turned into more of an overseer by then, but every now and then, when a job called for a delicate hand or something artistic, I'd still pick up the hammer. That was the part one loved most, the part that reminded me who I was. Time kept moving, and the kids kept growing. In 1998, when I was 47, Jamal finished high school and told me he wanted to stay in the same line of work. "Dad, I want to study mechanical engineering," he said. I can't describe how proud I felt hearing that. My father had barely managed to get me through elementary school, and now I was sending my son to college in Atlanta. Zoe was still in high school then, already showing a passion for books and history, just like her mother. She'd sit for hours reading or scribbling in her notebooks, and Grace would beam every time she caught her doing it. When the year 2000 came around, I was 49, and life felt perfect. Grace and I celebrated our 25th wedding anniversary that year. We held a small ceremony to renew our vows. Grace looked stunning in a light blue dress that made her eyes shine even brighter. Our children were there, our family, our friends, people we'd shared a lifetime with. I remember looking around that room, listening to the laughter, and thinking, we did it. Everything we dreamed of is right here. In 2002, when I was 51, Jamal graduated college and came back home to Willow Creek. He'd had job offers in Atlanta, good ones too, but he said, "Dad, I want to work with you. I've got ideas to help us modernize the company." I could see that spark in him, the same one I'd had at his age. His engineering knowledge, combined with my years of hands-on experience, gave the business a whole new life. Zoe took a different path. In 2003, at 19, she got into the University of Memphis to study literature. She didn't want to move to the city, though. She rode the bus back and forth every day, even when it meant long hours. "I'd rather stay in the peace of Willow Creek than the noise of Memphis," she'd say. Grace helped her with her assignments, edited her essays, and talked through all those classic novels Zoe loved. Watching the 2 of them together, so alike in mind and spirit, filled me with quiet pride. Our days settled into a comfortable rhythm. I left early for the shop, now officially called Dixon Metal Works and Fabrication, while Grace headed to the school. The kids went off to chase their own dreams. Evenings were for family. We always sat down to dinner together, no matter how busy life got, and talked about our day. Weekends were our time to breathe. Sometimes we'd go fishing at old Mr. Roberto's pond, just a short drive away. He had a nice stretch of water and always welcomed us like family. Those slow afternoons, Grace reading by the bank, the kids laughing, the water calm, those were the moments that made all the years of hard work worth it. Other times we'd drive up to Memphis to see a movie or have dinner out for a change. In 2006, when I was 55, Zoe graduated from college and started teaching English at the same school where her mother was principal. Seeing her follow in Grace's footsteps, with that same care and dedication for her students, filled me with pride. Grace was 53 then and already talking about retiring in a few years. The plan was for Zoe to eventually step into her place, and I couldn't imagine anyone better suited for it. That same year, Jamal, 26 at the time, met Nicole, a young woman from Jackson, Mississippi. She'd just moved to Willow Creek to work at the bank. They started seeing each other, and it wasn't long before we could all tell it was serious. Jamal brought her over for Sunday dinners, and she fit right in like she'd always been part of the family. Nicole had a warm smile, loved helping in the kitchen, and was eager to learn the local dishes Jamal had grown up with. She got along beautifully with Grace and Zoe. In 2008, they got married, a lovely celebration at the community center, much like ours had been decades earlier. Life moved on in its steady way. In 2010, when I was 59, I became a grandfather for the first time. Nicole gave birth to little Kyra, a sweet baby girl who looked just like Jamal did when he was born. The next year, Isaiah came along. Those two filled our home with laughter and light. Grace absolutely melted around the grandkids. She couldn't say no to them. I used to tease her, saying, "You're spoiling those children, woman." But truth be told, I was just as bad. I built Kyra a wooden dollhouse with tiny metal hinges and made Isaiah a little rocking horse. Growing older came easy with those small joys around. Zoe found love too. In 2012, when I was 61, she started dating Aaron, a math teacher who had moved from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, to work at the school in Willow Creek. He was quiet and serious, maybe a bit too reserved for my taste at first. Down here in the South, we're used to folks being a little louder, a little warmer. But over time, I saw that he was a good man, thoughtful and steady, and that he loved my daughter deeply. They got married in 2014. It was a smaller ceremony than Jamal's, but every bit as beautiful. Grace retired the next year, in 2015, when I was 64. After more than 40 years devoted to the children of Willow Creek, the school threw her a surprise farewell party. Former students came back. Some even brought their own kids who'd been her students too. Seeing the way people loved her, the way she'd touched so many lives, was one of the proudest moments of my life. As for me, by then I'd handed most of the day-to-day work at Dixon Metalworks over to Jamal. But I still went in almost every morning. "I can't sit still," I'd tell Grace. I liked chatting with the old customers, giving advice to the younger workers, and watching the business that had started so small now employ nearly 20 people. It gave me a deep sense of satisfaction, a quiet pride that the years of sweat and effort had meant something. Those were calm, contented days. The kind that makes you feel life has come full circle. Grace now dedicated herself to the garden, reading, and the grandkids who came to spend the afternoons with us. I found more time for myself too, to go fishing, to meet my buddies at the Veterans Club, where we'd play cards and swap the same old stories we'd told 100 times before. Sometimes, Grace and I even traveled, places we'd always talked about but never had the time to see. We went to Nashville, Savannah, and even joined a club tour down to New Orleans. It was a good season of life, like reaping the harvest from all the years we'd sown together. Everything stayed calm and steady until 2018, when I was 67. That's when I began to notice small changes in Grace. Nothing alarming at first, just little things that didn't quite fit. She'd always been a homebody, happiest tending to her flowers or baking in the kitchen. But suddenly, she started going out more. At first, it all seemed harmless. A knitting group on Tuesdays, volunteering at the church on Thursdays, a book club on Saturdays. It sounded wholesome, typical retirement stuff. I even told her, "It's good you've got your own things to do, Grace. After all those years working, you deserve it." She'd smile, kiss me on the forehead, and say, "It's good to keep the mind busy, Eli. You can't just sit around waiting for time to pass." But little by little, a few things started to feel off. One evening, she said she was heading to her book club, but the next day when I mentioned it to Miss Gloria, our neighbor who was part of that same group, she looked puzzled. "Book club? There wasn't one yesterday, Mr. Eli," she said. "It got cancelled. Ms. Teresa's sick." When I asked Grace about it later, she brushed it off. "Oh, I must have mixed up the days," she said quickly, then changed the subject. Another time, she came home with a new dress, beautiful, but not her usual style. When I told her she looked nice, she seemed uneasy, almost guilty. "Oh, the ladies from church convinced me to get it. It was on sale," she said, tucking it into the back of the closet like she wanted to forget it. I also noticed she'd started paying more attention to her looks. Grace had always taken care of herself, but now she was going to the salon more often, coloring her hair regularly, buying new creams. When I teased her about it, she laughed and said, "Well, now that I've got time, I can finally take better care of myself." Then came the phone. Before, she hardly touched the thing. It would sit forgotten on the kitchen counter for days. Now, it was always with her. She took it everywhere, even into the bathroom when she showered. It wasn't one big thing that caught my attention. It was all the little ones. Each one small enough to ignore on its own, but together, they started to whisper that something had changed. One night I woke up in the middle of the night and she wasn't in bed. The house was dark and still. I got up, thinking maybe she'd gone for some water, but when I reached the kitchen, I found her sitting there in the dim light of her phone, typing a message. "What are you doing up?" I asked. She jumped, nearly dropped the phone. "Oh, Eli, you scared me," she said quickly. "It's Zoe. She can't sleep, so we're texting." It seemed harmless enough. But the next morning, over coffee, I casually asked our daughter if she'd been having trouble sleeping. Zoe looked at me funny. "No, Daddy," she said. "I'm sleeping like a log." "Why?" I didn't tell her what her mama had said. I didn't want to start trouble, or sound like some suspicious old man chasing ghosts. Maybe I'd misunderstood. But little by little, the small things started to stack up. Then in January of 2019, when I was 68, Grace told me she'd signed up for a computer class in Memphis. "I don't want to be left behind with all this technology," she said with a smile. Classes were twice a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays in the afternoons. Sounded reasonable enough. I even offered to drive her to the bus station each time. A few weeks later, I got a call from Willie, an old friend who lives in Memphis. He'd seen me waiting at the station one day and wanted to meet up for coffee. During our chat, I mentioned that Grace was taking computer lessons in town. Willie frowned. "That's strange," he said. "My Dolores has taken all the senior classes around here. Never heard of any computer course." That comment stuck with me. When Grace came home that evening, I asked her about the class, where it was, who was teaching it, what they were learning. She answered every question easily, never hesitated. But there was something in her eyes that didn't match her words. That night, after she fell asleep, I did something I'm not proud of. I opened her purse and looked inside, just hoping to find some sign of those classes. A notebook, a flyer, anything. But there was nothing. No papers, no notes, no trace of this so-called computer course. The next week, I told her I had a backache and wouldn't be able to drive her to the station. "That's fine," she said right away. "I can catch the bus from the corner." When she left that afternoon, I made a decision I never thought I'd have to make. I decided to follow her. I asked Jamal, my most trusted employee, to come along and drive. We kept our distance, followed the bus all the way to Memphis. From inside the truck, we watched Grace get off at the station and walk, not toward any school or community center, but into a small cafe downtown. A few minutes later, a man showed up. Well-dressed, gray hair, probably mid-60s, sharp suit. He greeted her with a kiss on the cheek. Not romantic, at least, not obviously, but close enough to twist something in my chest. They sat there together for almost 2 hours, talking quietly, like people who'd known each other a long time. And that's when the ground beneath my feet started to shift. And I sat in the truck with Jamal, feeling my heart constricting more with every minute. My boy looked over at me, concern written all over his face. "You want me to go over there, Dad?" he asked softly. I shook my head. "No," I said. "Let's go. I've seen enough." We drove back to Willow Creek in silence. I stared out the window, my thoughts spinning in 1,000 directions. I hadn't seen anything openly romantic, just two people talking. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was innocent. But the lie about the class, it stuck with me like a thorn I couldn't pull out. When Grace came home that evening, I acted like nothing had happened. Asked her how her class went. She gave me the same story as always, full of easy details about what they'd learned that day. The way she spoke, so calm, so sure, left me even more confused. Was I overthinking things? Could that man really have been a classmate? Was I just being a jealous old fool? Over the next few weeks, I watched her more closely. On her class days, she came home with a light in her eyes I hadn't seen in years. She seemed more animated, almost younger somehow. Every now and then, she'd bring me little gifts. "I saw this in the window and thought of you," she'd say, handing me a new tool for the shop or a bag of those sweet pralines I loved. It was like she was trying to make up for something, but what, I couldn't tell. Then, in March of 2019, Grace surprised me again. "I'm thinking of joining a seniors travel group," she said. "They organize short trips for women, just nearby places." The first trip was to Nashville, planned for April. It caught me off guard. Grace had never been one to travel without me. When I offered to go along, she smiled and said, "It's a ladies-only thing, Eli. Just us girls." The trip lasted 3 days. We talked on the phone once or twice, and she even sent photos, her smiling in front of the Parthenon, a few street shots from downtown. Everything looked normal. But when she came home, I noticed a new necklace around her neck, a delicate little thing that hadn't appeared in any of those pictures. "The ladies in the group bought it for me," she said quickly when I mentioned it. The next month, May of 2019, she announced another trip, this time to Savannah, Georgia, for a festival. Again, it was just with the women. Something in me needed to be sure, so I asked for the organizer's contact information. Grace looked uneasy but eventually gave me a name and number. I called, and a friendly woman on the other end confirmed everything. The group, the trip, all of it. For a while, that eased my mind. But later, I found out the truth, that the woman I spoke to was one of Grace's friends, someone who'd agreed to back up her story if I ever called. After that, the trips became regular, one every 2 or 3 months. Each time she left, I told myself not to worry. But when she came home, she always seemed somewhere else. Her body was here, but part of her wasn't. And just like that, the closeness we'd built over 40 years began to fade. The warmth between us, our nightly talks, our laughter, started slipping away, piece by piece, until all that was left were questions I didn't know how to ask. We talked less, rarely went out together, and even our intimacy had diminished considerably. In September of 2019, I accidentally found a credit card statement of hers. I wasn't snooping, it just happened to fall out of a stack of mail. There were a few charges from a hotel in Jackson, Mississippi, on a weekend when she was supposed to have been home. When I asked her about it, she didn't flinch. "It's a mistake by the credit card company," she said calmly. "I've already called them about it." I nodded, pretending to accept her answer. But in truth, I didn't believe it. I just didn't have the strength to face what it might mean. By the end of that year, our son Jamal started to notice. One afternoon at the shop, while we were closing up, he looked at me and said, "Dad, is everything all right between you and Mom?" I lied. Told him we were fine. Just tired, getting older. I didn't want to drag the children into my doubts. After all, I still didn't have proof, only suspicions and small, unsettling moments that didn't add up. Christmas that year felt different. Everyone was there. Us, the kids, the grandkids, but the warmth that had always filled the house was missing. Grace was there in body, but not in spirit. She smiled at her phone more than she smiled at us, her eyes lighting up at whatever was on that little screen. The kids noticed. They exchanged quiet, uneasy looks, sensing something wasn't right between their parents. I stepped into 2020 with a heaviness I couldn't shake, a knot of uncertainty that pulled tighter every day. That February marked our 45th wedding anniversary. I wanted to do something special, something to bring us back to how we used to be. I bought flowers, made dinner reservations at a restaurant in Memphis, planned it all carefully. For a little while, it worked. Grace looked touched. We laughed, held hands across the table, talked about old times. Then she looked into my eyes and said, "It was 45 wonderful years, Eli." That one word hit me like a punch. I smiled, but inside, something broke. The following month, March of 2020, brought the moment that would change everything. My brother Curtis had fallen ill with heart problems, and I planned to drive up to Memphis to see him. Grace, as she often did by then, said she wouldn't come. She had church commitments and things to handle in town. I didn't argue. I was used to her refusals by then. The night before I was supposed to leave, my nephew called. Curtis had been admitted to the hospital, and visiting wasn't allowed. He told me to wait a few days before coming. And that's when the idea came to me, an idea part foolish, part desperate. I decided I would pretend to go anyway. I'd drive off in the morning, then circle back home later that same day. Part of me told myself it was a romantic gesture, to surprise her, to maybe spark something between us again. But deep down, another part of me, the part that had been watching, doubting, fearing, wanted to know the truth. And that's how I came to that day. The day I made the decision that would change everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, and the woman I loved for 45 years. Little did I know the truth would hurt far more than all my suspicions ever had. It was Wednesday morning, March 11th, 2020. My suitcase was packed, and I told myself I was ready to leave. I gave Grace a quick kiss on the cheek, a habit that had slowly replaced our long goodbyes. "Take good care of Curtis. Give him a hug for me," she said, her voice full of genuine concern for my brother. "I'll be back next Tuesday," I replied, forcing a smile. The lie sat heavy in my throat. I climbed into my truck and pulled out of the driveway, but instead of heading for the station, I drove straight to the shop. Jamal already knew I wasn't really traveling, though I hadn't told him why. I said I wanted to surprise his mother, maybe try to rekindle things between us. My son, always respectful, didn't press. "You need me to help with anything, Dad?" he asked. "No, son. Just don't tell anyone you saw me today," I said. I stayed at the shop until noon, helping out with a few projects just to pass the time. Around lunch, I went to Mr. Earl's diner on the corner and had a bowl of chili, a quiet place where no one would think twice about seeing me. Then I stopped by the grocery store for a few things, a bottle of the dry red wine Grace liked, ingredients for a slow-cooked dinner I'd been meaning to make her, and a bouquet from Ms. Loretta's flower shop. By 3 in the afternoon, I was back near the house. I parked a block away to keep things discreet, my heart beating faster with every step. Using my key, I slipped through the back gate, careful not to make a sound. The March sun warmed my back, the jasmine from our garden scented the air, and I could hear mockingbirds singing in the next field. Every detail of that moment is still carved into my memory, because it was the last time life felt ordinary. The house was silent. "Grace," I called softly. No answer. Her car wasn't in the garage. Strange, since she almost never went out on Wednesdays. That was her soap opera day, the one she spent glued to the rerun channel. I put the groceries in the kitchen and checked the bedroom. The bed was neatly made, everything in its place. But in the bathroom, some of her creams and makeup were missing. That's when a faint unease started to crawl up my spine. I walked back to the living room, puzzled. Maybe she'd gone to visit a friend or run an errand. I decided to wait. I sat down on the couch and turned on the TV, flipping through channels without really watching. The minutes stretched endlessly. 4 o'clock, 5, 6. The sun dipped below the trees, and the silence in the house grew heavier. Grace still hadn't come home. I started to worry. What if something had happened to her? I grabbed the phone and called her cell. Straight to voicemail. I tried again. Same thing. Then I called Zoe. "Honey, do you know where your mother is?" She sounded surprised. "I thought you were traveling, Dad. Mom didn't say anything about going out today." I hesitated, not wanting to sound alarmed. "Yeah, I just called to check in, but no one picked up," I said, pretending it was nothing. After that, I called a few of Grace's friends. None of them seemed to know where she was, or at least, that's what they claimed. Looking back, I realized some of them sounded uneasy, like they were holding something back. At the time, I told myself I was just overthinking, letting anxiety get the best of me. By 8 that night, I couldn't take it anymore. I drove to the sheriff's office. Willow Creek is a small town. Everyone knows everyone. Officer Miller, who was on duty, had known me for years. "Calm down, Mr. Eli," he said gently after I told him what happened. Mrs. Dixon's a responsible woman. I'm sure she has a good reason to be out. It hasn't even been 24 hours. We can't file a missing person report yet. I went home, feeling even worse. The night dragged on endlessly. I couldn't sleep. I sat in my old armchair in the living room, eyes fixed on the front door, waiting for the sound of her car pulling into the driveway. But it never came. Morning arrived, and I was still alone. I called her cell again, still off. I was about to head back to the sheriff's office when something crossed my mind: her checkbook. Grace always kept a small notepad tucked beside it, where she jotted down appointments, reminders, and phone numbers. I went to the drawer where she usually kept it. The notepad was there. I flipped through the pages, hoping for a clue. On the page for that week, under Wednesday, there was a single word: Art. That was it. Nothing else. Who could Art be? I turned back a few pages. The same word appeared again and again, always on days when she told me she had errands or commitments outside the house. That's when a memory hit me: the man I'd once seen her with at a cafe in Memphis months ago. Could he be this Art? I flipped to the back cover of the notepad. There, faintly written in pencil, was a phone number with no name beside it. My hands were trembling as I picked up the home phone and dialed. He answered on the third ring, a deep male voice. Hello. I froze. My throat went dry. Hello? Who is this? He asked again. I hung up. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it echoing in my ears. That voice, something about it, confirmed every awful suspicion I'd been trying to ignore. I couldn't sit there anymore. I needed answers. I called Jamal, the only person I trusted completely. Son, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, I need you to drive me to Memphis. We're going to check every hotel in the city, I told Jamal, without explaining the whole story. We spent the entire morning driving from one Memphis hotel to another. At every front desk, I showed a picture of Grace and asked if she was staying there. In some places, I caught a flicker of recognition in the staff's eyes, though they all shook their heads and said they had no record of her. It wasn't until the 10th hotel, a quiet little place on the north side of the city, that something finally shifted. The receptionist, a young girl, hesitated when she saw the photo. Did she check in as Grace Dixon? She asked, tapping at her computer. Yes, I said, feeling that awful knot tightening in my stomach. A few seconds passed before she looked up. No, we don't have anyone by that name. But her eyes said something different. Please, I said quietly, leaning closer. She's my wife. I'm worried. If you know anything, just tell me. She glanced around, making sure no one was watching. Then she lowered her voice. There is a lady who looks like her, but she's registered as Grace Miller. She checked in yesterday with a man. Room 214. Miller, her maiden name. A name she hadn't used in over 40 years. Is she here now? I asked, my voice barely holding together. The receptionist shook her head. They left early this morning, but they dropped off the key. So they're probably coming back. I thanked her and walked out with Jamal. You all right, Dad? He asked, seeing how pale I looked. No, I admitted. Not at all. But I need to figure this out. You can drop me off here and go back to Willow Creek. I'll call you if anything happens. After he left, I crossed the street and slipped into a small cafe with a clear view of the hotel entrance. I ordered a black coffee, though I never touched it. My eyes were glued to the front door. Time crawled. Noon. 1. 2. At 3:30 p.m., a car pulled up to the hotel. Her car. My heart froze. Grace stepped out of the passenger seat, smiling, glowing, even. She looked younger, lighter, happier than she had in years. Then the driver's door opened. A tall man with neat gray hair and sharp clothes stepped out, the same man I had seen with her in that cafe months earlier. He placed his arm around her waist with a familiarity that only comes from time, from closeness. And together, they walked into the hotel. I couldn't move. My mind went blank. Part of me wanted to storm across the street and confront them. Another part wanted to disappear, pretending none of this was happening. But I needed the truth, even if it shattered me. I sat there for another hour, trying to gather what little courage I had left. Finally, I stood up, paid for the untouched coffee, and walked toward the hotel. At the front desk, the same girl from before looked at me with quiet understanding. I didn't need to say a word. She just gave a small nod, confirming what I already feared: they were still in the room. I took the stairs slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the second floor, I stopped in front of room 214. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it through the door. I raised my hand to knock, but then I heard her voice, my wife of 45 years, laughing. It was the kind of laugh I hadn't heard from her in ages. "Arthur, you're impossible," she said between bursts of laughter. Arthur. So that was the name I'd seen in her notepad, the art. I drew in a long breath and knocked. The laughter stopped. A few seconds later, I heard slow footsteps, and then the door cracked open. There she was, my Grace, her hair down, wearing a blouse I didn't recognize. In an instant, her expression shifted from surprise to shock, then to panic. "Eli," she whispered. "What? How? Weren't you in Memphis? Can I come in?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. She hesitated, glanced over her shoulder, then opened the door wider. Inside, a man, Arthur Blackwood, stood by the window, visibly uneasy. He looked to be about 70, neatly dressed in a blue button-down and dark pants. "So," I said, my eyes moving between them, "this is it? All those trips, those classes, it was all a lie." Grace started crying. "Eli, please, I can explain." "No need," I said, cutting her off. "I think it's pretty clear what's going on here." Arthur took a small step forward. "Mr. Dixon, I know how this must look." "You don't owe me anything," I snapped. "From the sound of it, you didn't even know I existed." That's when I saw it, the look they shared. It wasn't just guilt or embarrassment. There was something deeper, something I couldn't quite name. "What is it?" I asked, confused. "What aren't you telling me?" Grace sat down on the edge of the bed, wiping her tears. "Eli, this is Arthur." "I already figured that out," I said sharply. "What I don't understand is why you're both looking at me like that." Arthur spoke this time, his voice quiet. "Because until a few weeks ago, I thought Grace was a widow." For a moment, the world stopped. The words echoed in my head, hollow and impossible. "A widow," I repeated. Grace lifted her eyes to mine, her face trembling between guilt and defiance. "Yes, Eli. I told him, and everyone here in Memphis, that I was a widow. That you died 2 years ago." It felt like the ground vanished beneath me. "You killed me?" I asked, barely believing my own words. "How exactly did you kill me, Grace?" She let out a long, weary sigh. "It was just easier that way," she said quietly. "I met Arthur at a state teacher's retirement event here in Memphis, not long after I retired. We talked. He was kind. He asked me to have coffee with him. I enjoyed his company, but I knew I shouldn't. I told myself it was harmless, but he kept insisting we meet again. Eventually, I said yes. When things began to get serious, I couldn't tell him the truth. So I said I was a widow." "And how did I die?" I asked, feeling the first waves of rage replacing the shock. "A heart attack," she murmured, lowering her eyes. "I told him it was sudden, that you were gone instantly, and I was learning to move on." Arthur looked stunned. "Grace," he said slowly, "you told me you two had gone to Savannah 2 years ago, and that he'd started feeling chest pains." Grace nodded, her voice breaking. "It was all a lie," she admitted, meeting my eyes. "Eli, I know how awful it sounds, but I needed something that was mine. After so many years taking care of everyone, you, the kids, the students, I felt like I had nothing left for myself. I wanted to feel alive again, even if it was wrong. Then why didn't you just ask for a divorce? I said, my voice shaking. Why this grotesque fantasy of killing me off in your story? She gave a small, bitter laugh, the kind that carries no joy. A divorce in Willow Creek? You know how people talk. They would have judged me, whispered behind my back. The kids would have been devastated. Everything I'd built, my reputation, my image, gone overnight. It was easier to live two lives. In Memphis, I was Grace Miller, the respectable widow who found love again. In Willow Creek, I stayed Mrs. Grace Dixon, the faithful wife of Eli from the metalworks. The coldness in her explanation left me speechless. I didn't recognize this woman. Where was the young teacher I'd fallen in love with? The mother of my children? The partner who'd shared my life for nearly half a century? Arthur looked stricken. Mr. Dixon, I swear I didn't know, he said, his voice trembling. If I'd known you were alive, if I'd known you were still married, I never would have gone near her. I believed him. His eyes told me the truth. He was as much a victim of her deceit as I was. How long? I finally asked. He hesitated. 2.5 years, he said at last. We met in September 2017, at that same retiree event. I taught history in Memphis. The timeline fit too perfectly. That was around the time I'd first noticed Grace changing. The distance, the strange excuses. And how often did you meet? I pressed. At first, once or twice a month, Arthur replied. Then more often. Grace said she had retirement meetings, teacher workshops, old colleagues to see. His voice trailed off, the silence between us heavy and suffocating. All those trips then, I said quietly. Yes, Grace admitted. When I told you I was going to Nashville or New Orleans with friends, I was actually going with Arthur. And the meetings here in Memphis, I said, not as a question but a statement. She nodded. On Tuesdays and Thursdays. When I said I had computer classes. I glanced around the room. 2 suitcases sat open, clothes neatly folded. The closet door hung slightly ajar, a half-packed life behind it. And this trip, supposedly to visit your brother, I said slowly. You were planning to spend the week together, weren't you? She nodded again. Yes. We planned it weeks ago. Something still didn't add up. And our children? I asked. Do they know about this double life you're leading? Of course not, she said quickly, almost horrified. They believe everything I've told them. Classes, book clubs, trips with friends. They don't know about Arthur. And my friends here in Memphis, they think I'm a widow. I turned to Arthur. And your family? Your friends? He shifted uncomfortably. My wife passed away 6 years ago. I have 2 grown kids in Atlanta. They met Grace last year. They believed she was a widow, just like I did. For a moment, the absurdity of it all almost made me laugh. So you've built an entire life here, I said. People know you as Grace Miller, the widow. And back in Willow Creek, you're still Mrs. Grace Dixon, the welder's wife. She didn't respond. Her eyes dropped to the floor. Why, Grace? I asked, my voice breaking. Why didn't you just end things with me if you didn't love me anymore? Why all these lies? When she looked up, something had changed in her expression. The warmth I'd once known was gone, replaced by a kind of cold clarity. Because this way, she said evenly, I had the best of both worlds. In Willow Creek, I had respect, stability, our home, the children, the grandchildren. And here in Memphis, I had freedom, the thrill of something new, a chance to be someone else, someone without 45 years of history weighing her down. Her words hit like a punch to the chest. And me? I asked quietly. What was I in all this? She took a slow breath. You were my life in Willow Creek. The father of my children, the grandfather of my grandchildren. I didn't want to hurt you, that's why I never said anything. You didn't want to hurt me? I repeated, disbelief rising. Grace, you killed me in your imagination. You erased me from the world. How could that possibly not hurt? She lowered her gaze again. I never thought you'd find out, she said softly. And maybe, I realized, that was the only honest thing she'd said all day. I didn't speak another word. I simply turned and walked out of that hotel, leaving Grace and Arthur behind with their secrets and their lies. By the time I stepped outside, I was no longer the same man who had walked in. I took the bus back to Willow Creek, staring out the window but not really seeing anything. The world outside was a blur. Fields, trees, towns, all meaningless now. 45 years of marriage, a lifetime built side by side, and suddenly it felt like the whole thing had been a lie, at least the last few years of it. When I got home, Grace still hadn't returned. The house felt hollow, stripped of warmth. I went upstairs, pulled a suitcase from the closet, and packed a few clothes. Then I took the important papers, the deeds, the certificates, the remnants of a life that no longer made sense. I couldn't stay there another night. Not under that roof. Not surrounded by memories that had turned to ghosts. I went to Jamal's house. He opened the door, surprised, his eyes widening at the sight of me with a suitcase. Dad, what's going on? Where's Mom? I sat him down and told him everything. It was one of the hardest conversations I've ever had. I watched disbelief spread across his face, then anger, then heartbreak. It can't be true, he kept saying. Mom would never do that. The next day, Zoe came over too. They both wanted to hear their mother's side, of course they did, but I had proof. The notepad. The hotel clerk's statement. Even Jamal had been there with me when we confronted it all. When Grace finally came back to Willow Creek and tried to reach the children, they already knew. Those were dark days. The family I had spent my life building had crumbled. Grace tried to explain, to justify, but there are no words that can make sense of that kind of betrayal. It wasn't just infidelity. It was something deeper. She had erased me from existence. So I filed for divorce. At 69, I was alone again, forced to start over. The first few months were brutal. I rented a small house near the metalworks and buried myself in work. Jamal and Zoe stood by me as best they could, but it wasn't easy for them either. No matter what their mother had done, she was still their mother. In a town like Willow Creek, news travels fast. You can't hide from whispers. People would look at me with pity, the poor old man who'd been fooled by his wife. That pity stung almost as much as her betrayal. As for Arthur Blackwood, I later heard that he'd ended things with Grace too. He was just as blindsided as I was, realizing he'd been drawn into her lies. He'd thought he was with a widow. In truth, he'd been an unknowing part of a cruel story. Grace sold her share of the house after the divorce and moved to Memphis. She bought an apartment there. The children still talked to her now and then, but things were never the same. The family dinners, the holidays, the Sunday lunches, all of it disappeared. Now we only see each other for graduations, birthdays, the big things you can't skip. And every time we do, there's an emptiness in the air, a quiet reminder of everything we lost. Time passed. The pain never completely went away, but it softened around the edges, became something I could live with. I learned how to be alone, how to find comfort in the small things. Early mornings by the river with a fishing rod, lazy afternoons at the club swapping stories with old friends, the laughter of my grandchildren when they came to visit. Now, 5 years since that terrible day, I can finally say I survived. I'm 74, a few more wrinkles, a few fewer dreams, but still standing. The shop, now officially Dixon Metal Works & Son, is thriving under Jamal's care. I still stop by most mornings, not to work, really, but to chat, to feel the hum of the machines, to stay connected to something that's always been mine. I never got involved with anyone again. Not because there weren't chances. Willow Creek has its fair share of widows and divorcees who wouldn't mind some company from the old welder, but something in me closed off after that. I found peace in simplicity, in a life without complications, without hopes that could turn to disappointment. The hardest lesson I've learned is that you can live beside someone for decades and still never truly know the landscape of their heart. 45 years with Grace, And I never guessed what she was capable of. I never saw the depth of her unhappiness, the emptiness she tried to fill with another life, another version of herself. But I've also learned about forgiveness. Not forgiving her, necessarily, but forgiving myself. For a long time, I turned it all inward, wondering what I'd done wrong, when I'd failed as a husband so badly that she had to kill me off in her imagination just to feel free. It took me years to realize that not every wound has a reason. People change. Their wants, their hearts, they shift. Sometimes, no amount of love or effort can stop that. Old age brings a certain wisdom, I suppose. It also brings clarity, the understanding that life's too short to live in bitterness. I chose to move forward. I haven't forgotten, and I don't pretend it never happened, but I refuse to let that betrayal define me or dictate how I live what time I have left. These days, my children and grandchildren are my joy. Jamal runs the shop just fine, and Zoe still teaches with the same spark her mother once had. Kyra's 15 now, smart and curious. She wants to be an engineer like her dad. And Isaiah, 14, is already fascinated by metalwork. He's always asking me to show him how to weld, how to bend iron to his will. Maybe one day he'll be the third generation of Dixons keeping the trade alive. If there's one thing I've learned, one thing I'd tell anyone willing to listen, it's this: value the truth. No matter how painful, the truth sets you free. Living a lie, even a comfortable one, is like building a house on sand. Sooner or later, it all comes crashing down. Be honest, with yourself and with the people you love. And if you're unhappy, if you feel something is missing, say it. Before silence turns into something you can't undo. Look for solutions together. Don't build separate lives. And for God's sake, don't bury someone who stood by you for so many years, not even in your imagination. And remember this: it's never too late to start over. At 69, I had to learn how to live alone again after nearly half a century of marriage. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done. There were days I didn't think I'd make it, when getting out of bed felt like climbing a mountain. But I did. Now, 5 years later, I'm still here. Still standing. Still smiling. Still finding small reasons to be thankful for each new day. Life has a way of surprising us. Some surprises are kind, others not so much. What matters is how we face them, what we take from them, and how we keep moving forward. No one gets through life without scars. But those scars tell our story. They show where we've been, what we've endured, and just how strong we are. So if this story touched you, made you think, or maybe warmed your heart a little, leave a like for an old man of 74 who's still learning, still grateful, and still finding beauty in the pieces that remain. Have you faced a big disappointment in life? And how did you manage to move forward? Let us know in the comments below.